Committee on Commerce, Science, and Transportation will come to order. Today we will hear from Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg to discuss DOT's budget priorities for fiscal year 2023 and DOT's budget request $142 billion in fiscal year 2023. For context, this represents a 60% increase from the Trump administration's last DOT budget request of $89 billion. This is a significant increase is thanks to members of Congress in a bipartisan fashion and President Biden for making historic investments in our nation's infrastructure to create jobs, prepare our nations to remain competitive in the 21st century. The President's infrastructure package aims to solve freight transportation challenges we are seeing today. Our freight infrastructure was operating above capacity before the pandemic, but it was not able to handle a 44% increase in e-commerce sales in 2 years. Every part of our supply chain is strained due to capacity issues. Since the middle of 2021, the number of container ships waiting for a dock at U.S. ports have more than doubled, peaking at 150 in early February. Highway congestion has increased truck operating costs by $74 billion. So freight services issues have increased the cost of moving a single rail car by as much as $3,000, potentially increasing the cost of moving agriculture products, for example, from South Tacoma to the Port of Tacoma by 40%. To address these congestions, we must improve capacity, especially with freight shipments expected to increase 50% by 2050. I know the ranking member, this is a big priority for him, as it has been a priority for me in the state of Washington. The President's infrastructure project helps us by doing the very things we need to do to invest. A historic $2.25 billion over 5 years for the Port Infrastructure Program, which is a tripling of funding for this program this year. We have seen the benefits of this program through the modernization of Terminal 5 at the Port of Seattle, which is helping us deal with the increased volume of goods. $350 billion in roads and bridges over the next 5 years, a 50% increase from the FAST Act of 2015. And DOT has already allocated money to our states that are helping us improve infrastructure. $8 billion in freight rail over 5 years through the CRISI program, a program that we authored in the surface transportation bill passed out of this committee, focusing on a grant program to help eliminate some of these most congested bottlenecks in our communities. And very much appreciate our colleagues' support on that. A $5 billion increase over 5 years in the new programs for mega projects that have national economic significance. Projects like this in my state, the I-5 bridge over the Columbia River, which joins Washington and Oregon, but is a critical part of the I-5 critical network all the way from the Canadian border down to Mexico. The department is also charged with helping minimize the impacts that our transportation infrastructure has on our environment. That means more than a century of building roads and bridges and infrastructures have resulted in devastating impacts to salmon in our state and other fish passage in many other states. And so that is why the National Culvert Removal and Restoration Program, providing grants to states, local governments, and tribes to help remove these culverts and replace and improve fish passage. I look forward to hearing from the Secretary on this and many other issues. The department also needs to continue to focus on safety, both in air transportation safety and in our roads. The tragic increase of motor vehicle facilities has shown we have a long way to go. In my state, the state of Washington, there are 634 highway-related fatalities in 2021, which has the most increase since 2005. So I look forward to asking the Secretary about this. The budget request does help us improve safety and focusing on expanding the FAA's technical capacity with the National Air Grant Fellowship Program, an important step that Senator Blunt and I sponsored and was then included in our Air Transportation Safety Program. This is a great program in building the capacity of technical aviation assistance to every branch of government and including here on Capitol Hill. And so look forward and thank you for having that included in the budget. Safety must be a top priority in aviation, and it must be a top priority in aviation manufacturing. So we look forward to continuing to focus on that with the Secretary as well. So these are many issues that we have to discuss. We will be releasing soon our aviation report as it relates to the COVID package and the results of that package. I know that many of my colleagues today will also ask about refund issues, because part of that report will also show that refund issues and how the Department of Transportation could be helping consumers be guaranteed a right to those refunds. So with that, I'll turn it over to the ranking member.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and I do appreciate the Secretary being with us today, and also I appreciate the way he and his team have worked with our offices on getting funds to local communities and to the states in a way that will provide for infrastructure and jobs and better transportation around the country. Transportation plays a foundational role in developing, shaping, and advancing our economy. We need a transportation system that enables people and goods to move safely and efficiently. Last year, Congress passed the largest infrastructure bill in U.S. history. This legislation will make substantial investments in hard infrastructure, such as roads, bridges, railroads, ports, airports, pipelines, and broadband. And I will say that members of this committee and members of the Senate worked day in and day out with Secretary Buttigieg and other members of the cabinet and the administration on specific provisions of this legislation as we hammered out the specifics. The historic package, the infrastructure legislation, was carefully crafted to reflect bipartisan agreement among members of this committee. But the way it is implemented will be crucial in determining whether Americans actually see its benefits. The White House and Department of Transportation are responsible for implementing this law as is written, yet so far that has not always been the case. For example, I joined Senator Capito's letter to the Secretary expressing deep concern about the Federal Highway Administration's memorandum that discourages states from expanding highway capacity. And Madam Chair, at this point, I would like to enter into the record an opinion piece by the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, How to Kill American Infrastructure on the Sly.
Without objection.
Basically, let me just quote, if I might, some portions of this editorial. The White House Council on Environmental Quality is revising rules under the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA, for permitting major construction projects. CEQ Chair Brenda Mallory says the changes will provide regulatory certainty and reduce conflict. Instead, they will cause more litigation and delays that raise construction costs if they don't kill projects outright. Speaking further and later on in the piece about NEPA, while the 1970 law was intended to prevent environmental disasters, it has become a weapon to block development. The Trump administration sought to fast-track projects by limiting NEPA reviews on environmental effects that are directly foreseeable. For example, how affect a stream it crosses. Some liberal judges, however, have interpreted NEPA broadly to require the study of effects that indirectly result from a project, such as CO2 emissions. Now the Biden administration is mandating this, and I would interject at this point, I certainly hope that does not continue to be the case. Continuing to quote, CEQ's new rule will require agencies to calculate the indirect and cumulative impacts that can result from individually minor but collectively significant actions taken over a period of time. This means death by 1,000 regulatory cuts for many projects, end of quote. And I would simply say that I share the concerns of the writers of this editorial that many of the projects and many of the hopes we had coming out of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act will not, in fact, be easy to accomplish. Separately, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration is requiring motor carriers who want to participate in the pilot program for 18 to 21-year-old truck drivers to have a registered apprenticeship program with the Department of Labor. There was no mention of either the Department of Labor or registered apprenticeship programs in that provision of the statute. Again, which was hammered out very deliberately and carefully between Republicans and Democrats in conjunction with members of the administration. Additionally, the Department of Transportation is requiring applicants for major grant programs such as the Port Infrastructure Development Program, MEGA, or RAISE programs to consider climate change and environmental justice in order to receive funding despite no reference to those terms in those parts of the bill. I've heard from constituents who have decided not to apply because of these burdensome additional conditions. The administration should not be using this carefully crafted bipartisan law and carefully worded bipartisan law as an opportunity to insert its own liberal priorities. Nominating personnel is another key part to implementing this bill and ensuring the safety and efficiency of our transportation system. The FAA is currently without a Senate-confirmed administrator. We need one soon. Additionally, the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy needs the staff and resources to improve its facilities, upgrade the training, and keep students safe. I was pleased to see that the budget proposal includes an additional $11 million to begin addressing the campus's deferred maintenance and to hire adequate staff. I hope the Secretary will ensure that this excellent school has the resources it needs. The ongoing supply chain issues plaguing our economy are well known to the committee. Implementing the infrastructure law in a timely and effective manner will help address many of those issues, but there are also more near-term solutions to consider. The Senate recently passed Senator Klobuchar and Senator Thune's Ocean Shipping Reform Act with unanimous support. This bill includes key provisions from the Freight Act, which I authored, and I urge the House to pass it without delay. So at any rate, it's good to have our friend, Senator Buttigieg, with us today to iron out some of these issues, and I look forward to his testimony.
Thank you, Senator Wicker. And I would say you're reminding me that, you know, there's several positions that are being held on the Republican side that are critical, I think, to safety, NHTSA, General Counsel, a variety of things. So I forgot to mention that, so we'll get to those in the questioning period. Thank you, Secretary Buttigieg, for being here. Thank you for steering this major investment into our economy. As we saw during my recess anyway, a lot of this investment in real terms coming into effect, so very heartening in our community. So thank you for your leadership here, and we welcome you, and please make your opening statement.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Chair Cantwell, Ranking Member Wicker, and to all of the members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the Department of Transportation's fiscal year 2023 budget and priorities. I want to first thank the members on both sides of the aisle who delivered the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the fiscal year 22 omnibus. This committee helped to deliver much-needed resources vital for communities across America. Because of these historic investments, the department is now in a much stronger position to help build the transportation future the American people need and deserve, one that's saferable for everyone, from families transporting kids to businesses moving goods. And we've acted urgently and responsibly to do just that. Let me offer just two examples. We recently saw the dramatic collapse of a bridge in Pittsburgh, where, if not for the divine grace of a snow day, there could have been school buses driving over that 8-story high bridge when it fell. In December, we provided the biggest federal highway funding to states in decades, $52.5 billion, to make roads and bridges safer, more modern, and more resilient so people can get to where they need to go. Another urgent priority is addressing the pandemic-driven supply chain disruptions and accompanying inflation, while also ensuring our nation's supply chains are resilient into the future. We've helped to create temporary or pop-up inland ports in Seattle, Savannah, and Oakland. We've made available an unprecedented level of funding to modernize America's port infrastructure. And knowing that people are the most critical element of supply chains, we've acted to help truck drivers, including by addressing time spent behind the wheel without being paid, guiding states to build additional safe truck parking, and nearly doubling the number of registered apprenticeship programs so that more new drivers enter the profession with high-quality, paid on-the-job training. All of this is designed to help move record amounts of goods more quickly and to stem the rising costs of shipping, and it's showing results. A few weeks ago in Tell City in southern Indiana, at a site visit alongside the State Transportation Commissioner, I saw how our federal port investments will support shipments of pig iron through a small river port, supporting jobs for over 1,000 people at a nearby foundry. Across the country, the total number of container ships waiting for berths at U.S. ports has dropped by about 35% since peaking in early February. Employment for trucking rose in 2021 to its highest level since 1990. And grocery and drugstores have products in stock at almost the exact level as before the pandemic. But there is still far more to do to achieve our goals, from lowering costs to giving people back time in their day. In fiscal year 2023, we're poised to build on early progress with the President's budget for the Department of Transportation that totals $142 billion, including $36.8 billion in advance appropriations provided by the Infrastructure Law. Here are a few highlights. Safety remains our top priority, and our request includes funding to help address the crisis of deaths on America's roadways, as well as to support the elimination of railroad grade crossings that are frequently blocked by trains, which will save lives and improve supply chains. With $4 billion for RAISE and the new MEGA program, we will rebuild century-old infrastructure and lay the groundwork for America to compete and win in decades ahead. We'll also start implementing our new rule for ambitious fuel efficiency standards, projected to save the typical household hundreds of dollars in gas costs, accelerate our move toward energy independence, and reduce billions of metric tons of carbon dioxide emissions. We'll invest a total of $17.9 billion to reverse decades of underinvestment in intercity passenger rail and make fast, reliable train service available to more people. And to keep making progress on supply chains and help move goods faster and fight inflation, we'll invest a total of $680 million to modernize ports, $3 billion to improve the roadways that carry the majority of America's freight, and a total of $1.5 billion for CRISI grants to improve freight rail. That's just a sample of the improvements the American people will experience when they fly, drive, ride, and shop, as enhancing our transportation systems directly helps lower the transportation cost of goods and services. This type of infrastructure transformation only happens at most once every generation, and it only happens if we work together. So I want to again thank you for showing that democracies can deliver for the people they represent and for ensuring that the United States remains the global economic leader. And I look forward to addressing your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary, and thank you for that fine point on how infrastructure investment helps drive down the cost of moving goods and services. I tell you, my state feels this at every corner of our state, and so we certainly appreciate it. If I could, I got several issues, if I could just run through them as quickly as possible. The Port Infrastructure Grant Program that you mentioned, we want to get those funds. Will you commit to working with me to ensure that the recipients are able to execute their own funding as soon as possible to help speed up the port infrastructure congestion issue? Yeah, sorry.
Sorry, I didn't catch the question.
So the question is, so you're basically, I've heard from stakeholders, there's still confusion about how the Maritime Administration will administer the new authority. So I'm asking you, will you commit to work with me and others to ensure recipients can execute their own funding as soon as possible projects?
Yes, absolutely. The window for 2022 applications is open now, and we want to see these dollars deployed as promptly and effectively as possible.
I mentioned this issue of delayed people holding up some of your nominees, particularly NHTSA. Since safety is such an issue and fatalities I mentioned in my opening statement, can you describe the impacts these delays are having on the department?
It would certainly be helpful to have our nominees confirmed. People throughout the department are doing a terrific job, but there's no substitute for having a confirmed operating administration head. And then, of course, that allows for a deputy to fully rise to their responsibilities as well. That's important in NHTSA for safety. I would add for the CFO of a department that's been asked to handle such an influx of funding, our general counsel and many other positions which we are very eager to see confirmations in for the benefit of safety, supply chains, fiscal responsibility, and everything that we're responsible for managing.
And I mentioned thank you for the air grant support in the budget. Will you continue to oversee the FAA and make sure that they are adhering to the law that we passed on aviation safety and implementing those rules into law?
Yes, we recognize the importance of promptly and effectively implementing that law. My understanding is about 30% of the new requirements or prescriptions have been addressed so far, and we'll continue working to ensure that FAA meets its obligations and responsibilities.
Well, I think everybody's concerned with a change in FAA administration, that we do have consistency and continuity here and continue to make progress, that the FAA is the final word here on safety, and they have to continue to make the improvements that we've outlined by Congress. One of the issues I know my colleagues are going to bring up, my colleagues Senator Markey and Blumenthal, and we appreciate their leadership, is, you know, on these new rules to address policy gaps in significant delays in flights and how that was defined and whether consumers deserve to have refunds. What is DOT going to do to help us set a standard so that our consumers, you know, we're going to say that the PSP and the supply chain support by all of us collectively had positive results. But we also want to make sure that our consumers who felt the impact of the pandemic also get their response from the airlines in a timely fashion. So what DOT has not set a standard for how long delay must be in order to be significant. Are you going to be doing that?
We agree, in addition to supporting a robust aviation sector, we need to make sure that airlines are held accountable for doing right by consumers and make sure the traveling public's treated fairly. Part of how we responded to that is by enforcing on an airline's obligation to provide refunds when there are cancellations or significant changes to flights. We fined one airline $4.5 million for extreme delays in providing refunds. And we're investigating and actively working on a rulemaking that would address protections for consumers unable to travel due to restrictions or concerns related to serious communicable disease. That rulemaking should be ready to go to OIRA within days, and welcome the chance to work with you on other ways to make sure that consumers have a positive experience and are treated fairly by airlines.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I know we're going quickly through all these, but if I could get you on two other issues. On the budget request for additional 1.5 for mega projects and RAISE, can you explain what the additional funding support projects look like and why this is so important?
Well, these are flagship programs that are going to allow us to support projects around the country, everything from projects in the mega program too large or complex to fund through traditional streams to RAISE, much of which will go to smaller rural projects. Again, we view it as important both for passengers and for goods movement in the U.S.
Thank you. And then on the culverts, I have to take exception to my colleague. You know, we agree on many things. You know, NEPA was something that Scoop Jackson was the author of, the National Environmental Protection Act. And, you know, when I look at my state and look at the transportation infrastructure that's literally ruined, you know, stream passage and, you know, the things that we're now having to pay so much for because of the impacts. I look at these issues and say we have to be able to do both. I mean, that's what this transportation package said too. We have to be able to do both. We have to do smart transportation infrastructure and continue to help make sure that those things are protected. I love the greening of our ports, particularly because it's going to help us. We have air attainment quality problems throughout the United States, and this is going to help. So we've secured money for that. And I just want to know that will you work with NOAA to maximize the potential of this program and DOT to get together and push forward on this?
Yes, we're committed to working with NOAA, Fish and Wildlife Service, and everybody in the interagency who has expertise on this so that we can get those $200 million for this year out the door, and we hope to have that notice of funding opportunity out this summer.
Great. Senator Wicker.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just following up on that, Mr. Secretary, stream passage would be a direct effect of building a bridge or a road, would it not?
Yes, a culvert or road construction, depending, of course, on the specifics of the project.
Okay, not an indirect or a cumulative effect. Let me just start by getting you to commit to following the requirements of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law as enacted.
Absolutely. Our aim and our intent is to apply this law as written.
Okay. Well, let's start with the truck driver apprenticeship program. I think it's important to enact this. This would allow 3,000 18 to 21-year-old drivers to participate in operating interstate commerce. And And as I mentioned in the statement, the additional requirement that is not in the statute is that truck carriers seeking to participate in this program register with the Department of Labor as a registered apprenticeship. As you know, there are Department of Labor apprenticeship programs. There are also highly effective and longstanding state apprenticeship programs. Both processes are burdensome in many degrees, and for example, in my state of Mississippi, community colleges have implemented their own apprenticeship programs, which have been quite effective. Where in the section of the law does it say that the Labor Department should require Department of Labor apprenticeship programs?
So I don't think that's in the text of the law. It is in our aim to comply with the text of the law. 23022 requires that we stand up this program, and it set a pretty short deadline, 60 days for FMCSA to begin the Safe Driver Apprenticeship Program. Our challenge, of course, is to do so both swiftly and safely. And in this case, we believe that the best way to make sure that we're meeting our obligation to ensure that there's no trade-off in safety as we introduce these younger drivers to the road is to make sure that there's a clear and effective pattern for mentorship and education. So having an already existing framework and a successful one, we feel helps us to attract the broadest range of participants and have a high level of retention too, knowing the excellent retention record of that program. They're also known to lead to positive pay.
It is an already existing framework that is preferred by the political left. There are other existing and effective frameworks, and I can tell you we're just going to have a discussion about that because I think you've chosen winners and losers in an arbitrary way there. Have you been to the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy yet, Mr. Secretary?
I haven't. The Deputy Secretary was there recently, and I'm looking forward to an upcoming visit. We don't have a date set just yet.
Okay, I think you'll be very, very impressed, but we've got some needs there. And there is a National Academy of Public Administration, NAPA, study which says we're woefully behind in expertise, training, technology, and personnel. And yet, it's still a great academy, but we've got to prioritize these recommendations. Will you commit to working with this committee in tracking the progress on steps for these recommendations?
Absolutely. We've been tracking it closely from my office already, and again, look forward to seeing how it's going on the ground, too.
Okay. Now, did you... what do you think about this editorial that I read to you? There's no language in the infrastructure law that authorizes DOT to require applicants to address factors that are not listed in the statutes. And our goal is to start building this infrastructure quickly. For example, automobile dependence in building roads and bridges. I mean, that's almost like a non sequitur. That's going to make it harder. Saying that the applicants must consider automobile dependence as a factor.
Well, the idea here is to make sure that people have options, whether driving a car, whether taking transit, whether using active transportation. We want to make sure that we're moving toward a roadway and highway network across the country that provides the most and best options for Americans to get around.
Okay, well, I think what we are seeing and what this editorial indicates is that we're going to see a lot of minor factors pile up and slow projects, much as the litigation has done over the years. You will admit that the litigation that this opinion piece mentioned has, rightly or wrongly, served to delay the implementation of infrastructure projects. You will admit that, will you not?
Well, our intention is to build good stuff well, and we would like to do that promptly, too. I would say part of being prompt is making sure that there is compliance with the law on the front end, meaning there will be less litigation later in the life of the project.
Let's comply with the law and not read in requirements that are not in the statute. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Wicker. Senator Klobuchar.
Thank you very much to both of you. Thank you, Secretary, for being here and for all your good work. You and I have discussed this bill a few times, and I so appreciate your leadership on the shipping and supply chain. I think we know that we have to get this done. The past 2 years have highlighted significant supply chain disruptions. Price of shipping containers increased fourfold. Of course, that goes on the backs of consumers because the prices are passed down to them from manufacturers and farmers who are hurt by this. And that's why Senator Thune and I joined together, and I want to appreciate the leadership of the chair and the ranking member on this as well, to get our bill passed, the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, through the Senate, not just this committee, thanks to the chair and ranking's leadership, but also through the Senate floor. And now it's over in the House where there is a similar version. But I just want to get this done, as does Senator Thune, because I think the more that time ticks on, as we know, anything can happen in this town. Things get delayed, and we have a winner here, and we have a winner in terms of pushing the shipping industry and actually showing that the Congress speaks with one voice when it comes to shipping rates. Could you talk about the urgency from your perspective of getting this done?
Thank you. Yes, we know we're in an urgent moment when it comes to our supply chains. Anything we can do to make shipping more efficient and effective is going to make a difference at a time when we're fighting inflation with everything that we've got. I want to recognize your leadership and that of others that you mentioned in moving the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, and the sooner that it can be enacted and signed, the sooner the FMC can get to work with support from my department in making good on those provisions.
Exactly. And I mean, there is some talk of putting it in another bill. I just, whatever. But months and months can go by. A bill that has like 60, 70 conferees. And we actually have, all of the groups have endorsed this bill. And I really think it's time to move and work this through with the House, because the months go by and we don't send the message that we want to the international shipping conglomerates. Other thing I wanted to talk about was trucker shortages. In addition to the congestion at our port, we've also faced a shortage of truck drivers. I think estimated the trucking industry was short a record 80,000 drivers in 2021. Could you talk about what the department is doing on that front?
Yes, we view this as a major issue, and we need to make sure we're acting both to recruit and to retain truck drivers. On the recruiting side, we've been working with the Department of Labor on registered apprenticeships. We've seen a huge swell of trucking companies and consortia joining that. We're working to recruit more veterans. We have the pilot for younger drivers to safely enter the workforce. And we need to do more to make sure more women thrive in trucking careers. So we have a whole body that's been set up now to work on that. Then there's the retention piece. We lose about 300,000 truck drivers a year. And so we need to look at everything from working conditions to compensation. Among the conditions I would mention, critically important, truck parking. The sooner we can address those, the sooner that we can not only bring people into the career, but have people stay and thrive in that vitally important part of our supply chains.
Very good. Thank you for your emphasis on that. Distracted driving, I've long been working on that. We've got every day 8 people die and more than 1,000 are injured in crashes. We've got money in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Bill on that. Could you talk about the department's plans when it comes to distracted driving?
We've made such gains as a country when it came to impaired driving, only to see the rise of distracted driving, especially since the advent of the smartphone. We need to recognize this as a major source of risk, a major factor in fatalities. And as we roll out our new National Roadway Safety Strategy, attention to this will be one of the core elements of our work to save lives on our roadways.
Okay, very good. Going a little more local, the Blotnick Bridge, which connects Minnesota and Wisconsin. In fact, the president, the day after the State of the Union, visited the Blotnick Bridge, and earlier this year, your department announced significant funding for a number of grant programs, including mega projects that are too large or complex for traditional funding programs. How is the DOT coordinating and communicating with state departments of transportation to promote competitive grants? Appreciate the help we've already gotten with the congressionally initiated projects, as well as the grants you're already giving out at, in my mind, a rapid pace, as we all know from being home. But talk about some of these bridge projects and how important they are.
Thank you. We've made over $70 billion available. There's more where that came from in programs ranging from the Bridge Investment Program to the award selections for programs like MEGA, which you cited. This is especially important for these large bridge projects that are simply bigger than what's contemplated by a lot of our competitive grant programs. We're in close touch with state departments of transportation. I would add governors who are often enthusiastic about these major bridge projects, and we're committed to making sure that there's a smooth process for those applications.
Okay, very good. Thank you very much, Secretary.
Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, again, welcome. We are so pleased to have you before us. A couple of things I want to touch base with you on today. There have been just billions of taxpayer dollars that have ended up with fraud and abuse through some of the grants and the different projects that are out there. And I know that when you look at the infrastructure funding, some of the money that is used for enhancements, not for roads and bridges, but for walking trails, bike paths, things of that nature, have gone to groups that I've got some questions about. I think Tennesseans have questions about them. You've got groups like Speak for the Trees, which received a grant for a project utilizing storytelling and tree walks aimed to increase awareness surrounding inequitable tree canopy cover. So talk to me about how you can assure us that this money is going to go to what is needed: roads, bridges, railways. You've already mentioned today a bridge collapse. You were with me in Memphis when we toured, and DOT worked with Tennessee and Arkansas to address the bridge collapse. So talk with me a little bit about your monitoring of these grants and making certain this money goes for infrastructure.
Well, thank you, Senator. And of course, I remember well the visit to Tennessee and our many conversations about the importance of the I-40 bridge in Memphis, which went through that closure. Every program that's in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law will be subject to very strict controls and very high standards. And I can tell you that in addition to our own personal attention to this, the President has charged each of the department heads involved in implementing the infrastructure law to make sure that our inspectors general are empowered to provide the oversight that is a very important part of their work as well. Of course, if you encounter any case where you believe that the law is not being followed in the implementation or delivery of a project, we'd certainly encourage you to refer that to my office and or to the Inspector General because it is very important.
Well, we want to make certain that these groups, as the one I mentioned, that money is not going there when we need this for expanded roadways. There are construction projects that are needed to facilitate commerce. And to see money going to something like this is federal government money, it's taxpayer money. You and I talked earlier this morning about the automotive innovation that is taking place in Tennessee, whether it's with electric vehicles or with autonomous vehicles. And the AVs, let's talk about those for a minute, because China is investing heavily in autonomous vehicles and trying to be first to market, and for a vehicle that is going to be affordable. So I would like to hear from you what you are doing at DOT to support the states and to support some of the innovation that is taking place, not only with EVs, but also with AVs. And how are you working with the federal motor vehicle safety standards to set aside areas where this innovation and this testing can take place in order to move these to commercialization?
Well, thank you for raising such an important issue. The future of driving is unquestionably going to include automated vehicles. If we get it right, it means that our vehicle travel will be safer and more efficient. So we're going to continue our collaboration with Congress, with industry, with safety organizations, and other stakeholders to make sure that we are supporting this kind of innovation and making sure that it develops in ways that are safe and beneficial. I should mention that more than many people might be aware, there is not a lot that would stop an automated vehicle from being made available, provided that it meets federal motor vehicle safety standards. We regulate the car, to simplify a little bit, not the driver. But what we're doing is we're working to make sure that our regulations keep pace. I'll give you just a very simple example that could be illustrative here. We have a reference to airbag safety in passenger. It refers to passenger seats and driver seats. But of course, if there is no driver, we have to be concerned about a left seat and a right seat, not a passenger seat and a driver seat. So even just the very language of our regulations needs to be updated, and we're working on that right now to make sure we keep pace with the innovations that are happening.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'm out of time, but regulatory complexity continues to be a problem. I asked you about this when you came before us for your confirmation hearing. I will submit a question to you on that for the record. Thank you so much. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. I don't see Senator Young on the screen, and I don't see anybody on our side or on the screen, so I'm going to go to Senator Thune.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Buttigieg, I appreciate that the department has specifically committed to investing discretionary funding in rural areas consistent with congressional directives. However, I am concerned that pending regulatory matters, the department are not adequately considering rural states. In establishing the Roots Council, this committee directed the department through the council to ensure that the unique transportation needs and attributes of rural areas and Indian tribes are fully addressed during the development and implementation of programs, policies, and activities of the department. That's quoting from the directive. At last week's hearing before the Appropriations Subcommittee, you mentioned that a proposed greenhouse gas performance rule was sent to OMB. My question is, did the department subject this proposal to careful consideration by the Roots Council in developing this rule consistent with the congressional directive that I mentioned above?
I will check whether the Routes Council, which is an internal body, has been involved, or to what extent they've been involved in the GHG rule, and get back to you on that.
Well, if you would, I mean, I think that unique needs and attributes of rural areas, things like population density, need to be adequately addressed in the rule. And as you know, measures to reduce emissions in urban areas, such as increased public transit, are generally not viable in rural areas. So I would ask that if this particular review was not done by the Roots Council, that the rule be withdrawn from OMB and that review be undertaken. Is that something you can commit to ensuring that input from the Roots Council will be incorporated into the proposed rule?
I don't know that I could commit to withdrawing it from the OMB process, but I certainly will commit that this rule and any rule will consider the interests and needs of lower density rural and tribal communities.
Back to AVs, you just got a question on that. As you know, it's something I've worked over the past several years to try and passion, and that is to enact automated vehicles legislation, which I do believe is the key to ensuring that AVs are tested and deployed under a safe and consistent regulatory framework. And I remain committed to advancing this critical emerging technology. But in the absence of legislation, I believe it's essential for the department to establish a framework for the testing and deployment of AVs. Measures such as granting exemption petitions or updating relevant regulations are crucial to modernizing vehicle safety standards and gathering relevant safety data to ensure that the U.S. maintains its leadership in this important technology. Will the department continue to support AV testing and demonstration initiatives to ensure that the United States does not fall behind in testing and deploying this critical safety technology? And a follow-up, if so, could you describe the department's work to advance some of those programs?
Yes, thank you. The short answer is yes, and I'll share a couple examples that are within the realm of our existing authorities, even pending congressional action to pave the way for further work on AVs. One is that NHTSA has the authority under Section 555 to allow the deployment of vehicles that would be exempt from safety standards as long as an operator can show that it would lead to an equivalent level of safety. There's a cap on that, 2,500 vehicles per year for 2 years. And they can be extended too. One exemption so far has been granted to a company called Neuro. We do have additional petitions for exemption and are moving to try to address those promptly. The other thing I would mention is there's the exemption called Box 7, that's for imported vehicles. And a number of exemptions have been granted to allow for the deployment of AVs. That's on very restricted and specific routes, but another way to make sure that some of these innovations are playing out on U.S. soil.
The nation's trucking industry is the backbone of our economy, which we found out during the pandemic. And I've advocated for a regulatory framework that provides the flexibility that truckers need to safely deliver goods across the country, which is why I was pleased by the FMCSA's publication of a final rule in June 2020 to increase hours of service flexibility. And I will continue to advocate for increased flexibility for agricultural and livestock haulers who face unique circumstances associated with the goods that they transport. Could you describe how the department and FMCSA are adequately considering the needs of small truckers and haulers, I should say, of agricultural goods when evaluating some of these regulatory actions?
Thank you. Yes, we recognize that those who are hauling agricultural goods in the cold chain or in particular livestock face different issues than if you're hauling a load of shoes or other inanimate objects. And I think that the framework of exemptions and the different ELD requirements are intended to reflect that. As your question notes, this is about being safe and efficient at the same time. Our North Star, of course, has to be safety, but when we can provide flexibility that doesn't cut against the goal of safety, we will continue to do so.
Well, and I hope that you will look for ways to do that. That flexibility is really key, and there are in rural areas, particularly when you're hauling these types of loads, this kind of freight, I think there ought to be a different application of some of these regulations, which can be not only very expensive, but make it very, very difficult for agricultural producers to get their animals and commodities to their destination. Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Chair, sorry.
Thank you, Senator Thune. I'm stepping in for the chair, and as chair, I'm also actually up for questions, so I can recognize myself. Secretary Buttigieg, it's good to have you here with us. Thank you for the outstanding work you're doing, and appreciate your testimony here today. Last week, along with 11 of my Senate colleagues, including many members of this committee, I wrote to you about the need to develop a federal framework to facilitate the safe development and the deployment of autonomous vehicles here in the United States. I know you've already had some questions related to that, so you know that this committee is certainly very interested in this topic. And I know you've only had the letter for 6 days, so I certainly don't expect a complete answer to that letter here today, but certainly appreciate your attention. But I do want to have a conversation about autonomous vehicles. And the fact of the matter is that one day, I think we all know that cars will be both electric and they will be autonomous as well. Those are really the only two there are really only two open questions. First, will those cars be made here in America with good paying jobs, including good paying union jobs? And second, will we enact policies today to achieve the best outcomes for workers tomorrow? Or will we be reactive to what is inevitable coming? History has taught us that technological change is inevitable, and while that has produced benefits for society, there's plenty of examples of workers, unfortunately, getting left behind as this technology moves forward. So I believe we can seize the moment to mold a new pattern, because good jobs and innovation, in my mind, do not have to be and are not mutually exclusive. So my question for you is, do you agree with me that we can both embrace new technology, like autonomous vehicles, while opening up opportunities for current transportation workers, in addition to creating new jobs? And what are some of the steps you think are necessary for us to achieve that vision, if you agree?
Well, thank you. We very much agree. And like you are interested in making sure that this transition, whether we're talking about electric or automated, is principally made in America, that it creates more opportunity. And it can, but we need to provide the right kind of policy framework. We're doing everything we can with existing authorities to make sure that it unfolds in a way that is safe, that builds the confidence of Americans in these technologies, and at the same time provides the flexibility for the kinds of research, development, and testing that are needed. And believe that there is more that we can be doing with our existing authorities, but also very much believe we need to work with Congress to have a legislative framework that adequately contemplates these kinds of vehicles becoming more widespread.
Well, I appreciate that, and I'll get back to, if we have time, more questions related to that, but I want to shift a little bit here to a different topic. Over the past year, we've seen substantial congestion at ports on the East Coast and the West Coast, which all contributed to significant delays and problems for our economy. And I believe that part of the solution to ensuring that we don't see congestion like this again is to make better use of our ports in the Great Lakes, which can play a significant role in easing congestion at coastal ports. They improve the efficient movement of freight and reduce emissions in the process, which is great for our environment. However, in order to achieve these goals, we need to ensure that all seaports have equitable access to federal resources and are held to the same standards. And that's why I'm committed to working with our smaller seaports as they work to balance security concerns and evolving threats with port business operations and the need to move freight. So my question for you, Mr. Secretary, is can you describe your vision for how we can better support smaller seaports and ensure equitable distribution of resources, as well as the role that they can play in alleviating congestion at our larger coastal ports? As someone who is intimately familiar with the Great Lakes region, I'd love to have your thoughts.
Well, thank you. This is a very important dimension of how we can address our supply chain challenges and move goods in ways that are more environmentally responsible for the long run, too. As you know, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law authorized a major step up in the Port Infrastructure Development Program, $684 million being made available this year if you combine the supplemental funding with what Congress enacted. And so we recognize the importance of supporting our ports, and while most of the headlines and the public imagination might center on our largest container ports on the east and west coast, our Great Lakes ports, and I might add our river ports, play a very important role. For example, with PIDP, recently we were able to support an investment in Marquette, Michigan, I think another one in Alpena, which might seem small relative to what you might see in LA or Long Beach, but are no less important for that regional economy, and those investments add up. So you have my commitment that with PIDP, we will be paying attention to the potential of smaller inland and freshwater ports, as well as our large coastal ports.
Well, it's good to hear. In fact, this weekend, I'll be in Traverse City at a graduation ceremony for our Great Lakes Maritime Academy there, which will be graduating mariners that are on the Great Lakes freighters. And I know you see those freighters as well. Move tremendous amount of cargo. There's tremendous opportunities for us to continue to grow that industry within the Great Lakes, and appreciate your support for us for doing that.
Thank you.
Thank you for your answers. Senator Fisher, you are recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Senator Peters. Good morning, Mr. Secretary. It's nice to see you. Mr. Secretary, in March, SkyWest filed a 90-day notice of its intent to terminate service at 29 essential air service communities. Nebraska has 3 communities served by SkyWest: Kearney, North Platte, and Scottsbluff. I'm concerned about this development because essential air service is critical for these rural communities. Last week, I sent continue issuing a hold-in order for these Nebraska airports, requiring SkyWest to perform the minimum service required by statute. Will you commit to continue issuing hold-in orders to SkyWest and ensure their contractual obligations are upheld in providing service to these rural communities?
Well, thank you for the question. We recognize how important EAS is and share your concern about this announcement by SkyWest. As you know, the DOT has acted to order them to continue service. And while we'll prepare a formal response to your letter, I can tell you that we envision extensions in order to make sure that the public is served.
Thank you. I hope that you'll work with my office so that we can preserve the Essential Air Service program that ensures that smaller communities across my state and across this country can access larger aviation networks. Mr. Secretary, I found recent comments from political appointees within the administration to be extremely worrisome when it comes to decision-making that is traditionally left up to our states. For example, internal guidance about the December 16th FHWA memo directed staff on how to implement not only discretionary grants, but also formula funding and the NEPA process. These actions do not align with the bipartisan intent of the law, a law that I supported. It appears that this administration intends to have a heavy-handed and really an adversarial approach with the state DOTs in the implementation of the highway program. This is a stark departure for the FHWA's relationship with state DOTs historically. Mr. Secretary, do you feel the administration is trying to strong-arm state DOTs and local partners in the implementation of the law in order to advance the climate change goals that didn't make it into that bipartisan bill?
Senator, I would say we very much value our working partnership with state departments of transportation, and we recognize that there are different conditions and needs in different states. We viewed the guidance as stating common sense priorities that are important to us as an administration and a department, but also take care to make sure that any guidance that goes out internally or externally is compatible with the law as written. And certainly nothing, for example, in this guidance would preclude any lawful use of funds from taking place. And if there's ever any indication that comes to you of a project that is otherwise lawful that runs into trouble, I would certainly welcome a chance to speak with you about it.
Okay, I will hold that to you, sir, that we have that conversation, because I know it's not just my state department, but it is many others across this country that are concerned about the direction they see this going. In your view, what is the FHWA's administrator's role in working with transportation partners that have really boots on the ground and are charged with turning dirt to complete these projects? Ultimately, the success of this program, it really depends on the local and state partners to get the job done. It is not federal bureaucrats that are going to be doing this.
Well, again, we view this as a partnership. Of course, we have a responsibility to make sure that the states spend the funds in ways that are compliant with federal law. But ultimately, the bulk of the dollars are directed and deployed by those state leaders. And Federal Highways has a presence on the ground in every state, as you know, which allows us to have an especially tight working relationship. What I've found is that different states are at different levels of I would say, energy when it comes to pursuing some of the goals that are of interest federally and have different priorities based on conditions on the ground. But what I think is going to be most important is to ensure that these dollars are used in a way that maximizes the value for the taxpayer. And we recognize that that may mean different things in different contexts, but we'll, of course, be responsible for ensuring that any use is compliant with the law.
I appreciate that, because every state is different. Every state has funded different infrastructure projects within their state differently as well. And to be able to have a state set priorities without the federal government coming in, or without federally elected senators and representatives picking projects that they think should be priorities, I think you have to look at how they determine what those priorities are based on the plans that they have worked on forever, and the goals that they set forth in their 5-year plans, their 10-year plans, in meeting the growth that they see in various parts of their state. That's extremely important to be able to to have those decisions made at the state and local levels. Don't you agree?
Well, I agree, and I think it's in the context of a dialogue where, Washington is never going to know all of the details of local context. On the other hand, we may have access to best practices or important things to consider, and we value that exchange where we provide whatever knowledge, insight, and resources we can, and the states, of course, are on the ground actually implementing the formula dollars.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate your openness to have a conversation. You have been that way in the past, and I look forward to future conversations with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Fisher. Senator Rosen, you are recognized for your questions.
Thank you, Chair Peters, and appreciate you being here, Mr. Secretary. I'm just going to get right to it because I want to talk travel and tourism, something that's important to every single state in this country. And more than 2 years into the pandemic, international tourism and business travel to Las Vegas remain below 2019 levels. And our travel and tourism industry, well, it continues to face challenges. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act included my bipartisan bill with Ranking Member Wicker, the Tourism Act, which requires the Department of Transportation to update the National Travel and Tourism Infrastructure Strategic Plan and develop an immediate and long-term strategy for using infrastructure investments to revive the travel and tourism economy, of course, in the wake of the pandemic. So, Mr. Secretary, the law we passed requires these updates to be made and these strategies to be developed 180 days after enactment, which gives the department, until May 14th. Given this impending deadline, can you provide the committee an update today on the status of the National Travel and Tourism Infrastructure Strategic Plan?
Well, thank you. We know how important travel and tourism is to every economy, certainly to the economy of Nevada. And as you know, there was a lot of attention to this in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Previously, under the FAST Act, there was a National Advisory Committee on Travel and Tourism Infrastructure that DOT supported. That didn't get dedicated funding, but there are additional requirements now that are in the bill. That includes updating the strategic plan, which needs to include elements related to COVID-19 recovery. Also a study of how our own department evaluates travel and tourism needs in considering applications for grants that are coming in for our programs, and establishing a chief travel and tourism officer for our department to carry out the strategic plan and other related matters. I can tell you that we're working on all of these pieces. Right now, we're participating in the Tourism Policy Council that's led by the Commerce Department. They are developing the National Travel and Tourism Strategy. We want to make sure that that's completed in order for us to integrate that into our own travel and tourism strategic plan. And of course, our goal is to do so as promptly as possible.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. Like I said, I believe that travel and tourism probably in the top economic drivers for every state in this country, so it's a really important bipartisan issue. I also want to talk about electric vehicle charging stations in the West because in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, you authorized the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Formula Program. It provides funding to states to strategically deploy electric vehicle charging infrastructures. Well, the DOT's guidance for the program suggested a state's designated alternative fuel corridors for EVs will not be considered fully built out, a designation needed for states to be able to take full advantage of available funding until EV charging, that infrastructure is installed every 50 miles along a state's portion of the interstate highway system. Well, I just want to tell you the 50-mile criteria could be challenging for Nevada. Many of our western neighbors to meet, for example, on Interstate 80, in some of the most rural areas, there are 7 charging infrastructure gaps of more than 50 miles. And so, Secretary Buttigieg, how does DOT plan to provide western states some flexibility, these vast areas, rural, mountainous, frontier areas, given the challenges with geography and power resources in our rural communities?
Well, certainly, Senator, I understand that I-80 in Nevada looks very different than I-80 as it passes through South Bend, Indiana. And we're trying to ensure that our practices reflect an understanding of that difference. Of course, the intent of the National Electric Vehicle Investment Program is to address range anxiety on a road trip. You know that there would be access to reliable and excellent EV charging stations. And, we need to make sure that that's available even in remote regions. But I will say that the program allows states to submit requests for exceptions based on conditions that could be justified by a reasoned justification provided by the state. Each of those will be reviewed on a case-by-case basis. I don't want to prejudge how those will be viewed, but certainly any state that feels it has a merit for an exception request would encourage that to be submitted and considered.
Thank you. I appreciate that because, like I said, the Mountain West is going to have definite differences than that of Indiana for sure. The last question I will ask, if I could submit that for the record, is about autonomous vehicles and the challenges and opportunities to have about employing artificial intelligence and machine learning. I'll take those off the record. We're in the middle of a vote. I'm taking over the chair temporarily while others are voting, so I will take this time to thank you and recognize Senator Young.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. Good to have you before the committee. In your testimony, you discussed the crisis of deaths on America's roadways and the urgent need to address this major safety concern, and I couldn't agree more. One significant way to tackle this crisis in the short, medium, and long term is to support the development and deployment of automated vehicles. AVs have the potential to increase safety, reduce traffic, and benefit the disabled, blind, elderly, and others. The United States has long been at the forefront of automated vehicle innovation. However, as we approach a critical point in the evolution of the technology, and companies need opportunities to safely scale testing and deployment, other nations are creating opportunities that don't exist here in the U.S. For example, Singapore has dedicated over 620 square miles of road testing for AV testing. Secretary Buttigieg, are automated vehicles a priority of the Department of Transportation in this administration? And if so, do you support passage of a national AV framework?
They are a priority for us, partly for the reason you cited. We're in the middle of a crisis of roadway deaths, and one of the many promises that exists, or areas of promise that exists with AVs, is an opportunity to fundamentally change the safety outcomes on our roadways. We're doing what we can with the authorities and flexibilities that we have, but we lack a fully established legislative framework for that, and we would welcome one that would clarify authorities, and in particular, I would mention a division of labor that unofficially exists between the federal, my department, and the states, which doesn't really contemplate automated vehicles, and that's that we tend to regulate or assure the safety of the design of the vehicle, and the state DMVs are concerned with the driver. That framework makes sense until you have a scenario where the vehicle is the driver. I don't know how we can address some of those issues without the involvement of Congress.
Oh, thank you for that. What is DOT doing to support creation of pathways for the safe expansion of testing and deployment of automated vehicles in the U.S.?
So one thing we're doing is we're using the statutory authority that NHTSA does have to allow deployments of vehicles that are exempt from the vehicle safety standards. To give you a few examples of how this might come into play, a vehicle safety standard right now might prescribe where a mirror has to go in a vehicle that doesn't have a driver. Same thing around the steering wheel, et cetera. There is a limit to how many exemptions can be authorized. We can offer up to 2,500 per year for 2 years, so effectively 5,000 per applicant. So far, we granted one exemption, but we have more exemptions that have been requested and are working promptly to address those because we do want to see the kind of research, development, and testing continue, and of course, we want to see the AV future made in America.
Thank you, Secretary. The department's currently relying on a standing general order to collect specific safety-related data on driver assist technologies and automated driving systems being tested on U.S. roads. What is the goal of this standing general order, and why is the department relying on this standard general order approach as opposed to something like a pilot program or streamlined and expanded exemptions, which would, I would think, provide the data needed to inform future regulations as well as other policy priorities related to AVs?
So the standing general order is intended to help us to assess the safety of automated vehicles and also position our department to take action if an automated vehicle or an advanced driver assistance system vehicle poses an unreasonable risk to safety. And by doing that, by requiring operators and manufacturers of AVs and of ADAS systems to report crashes. In the case of automated systems, that's all crashes. In the case of driver assistance systems, it's serious crashes. We think allows us to gather that information and take action where needed. The most recent, or certainly one example, would be the Pony AI ADS recall, which took place in March of this year. That happened because of information that we had visibility on through that standing general order and the reporting that it mandated. Again, this is something that could no doubt be refined through updated congressional authorities, but it's an effort to make sure with the authorities that we do have that we're not missing visibility on anything that could pose a risk.
So would the administration be open to a specific directive that gave the department the authority to stand up a pilot program, which in turn I would hope would lead to more robust data collection about AVs?
I would certainly be interested in working with you to frame something like that.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you.
Senator Baldwin.
Thank you. Good morning, Secretary. It is good to see you. And a few weeks ago, I know you were in the state of Wisconsin visiting Coloma and highlighting rural investments from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and our ongoing work to support the engineering and road building workforce. I'm also really pleased to know that you were able to spend the day with high schoolers who were eager to learn about careers in the construction trades. So it's marvelous. When you came before us back in January of 2021, I asked you about Buy America waivers for manufactured goods. This waiver has been in place for over 40 years. And that's despite the clear intention of Congress to require that federal dollars only buy American-made manufactured goods. As you know, I pushed to include strong Buy America requirements in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. And this gave agencies 6 months to put procedures in place for full implementation by May 14th. However, last week, the department announced that it intends to seek a waiver of Buy America requirements to purchase American-made construction materials for 180 days. Given the history with perpetual waivers at DOT, I'm concerned by this waiver and would like your assurance that DOT intends to fulfill its Buy America requirements promptly and fully.
So we are committed to delivering on the intent of the Buy America provisions in the law. We recognize how important it is to the country and certainly to states like Wisconsin and to areas like my industrial Midwestern hometown. On April 28th, we posted for public comment the proposed temporary public interest waiver to provide recipients of DOT funding and their vendors what's intended to be a reasonable adjustment period. And that is open for comment through May 13th. But let me just back up and state philosophically, we view waivers not as an alternative to increasing domestic production, but only as a tool for allowing us to get on the right path. We certainly don't envision them as perpetual. We recognize that capacity has to be built, and so in order to deliver on these projects, some early flexibility may be needed, but we also recognize how important it is to balance that with serious requirements and clear demand signals that as soon as that capacity can be stood up domestically, it needs to be used rather than foreign sources.
Thank you. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law also contains historic investments in our nation's roads and bridges, and it allows us to ensure that those investments support infrastructure that is better able to withstand extreme weather and the effects of climate change. Secretary, the new law incorporates bipartisan legislation that I introduced called the Rebuilding Stronger Infrastructure Act, which will enable states to use emergency highway funding to rebuild infrastructure that is more resilient, that can withstand the next flood, the next storm. Can you implementation of that provision?
So the law, as you mentioned, requires several updates to the emergency relief program, including one to include resilience in the ER manual. I can tell you that there's a comprehensive update underway with Federal Highway to the manual, which will include these requirements. It's a big undertaking, but we are hard at work on delivering that. As you indicated, there is an increasing need to recognize when these funds go out that it makes little sense to have the asset be equally vulnerable after the spending as it was before, only to have potential further damage take place. So we recognize the importance of this provision in the law, and we're working as promptly as we can to deliver on it.
That's good. I'd also like to give you the opportunity to highlight the investments that are included in your fiscal year 23 budget request that also support stronger, more resilient infrastructure.
Yes, thank you. There are $7.3 billion in formula funding under Protect and $1.4 billion in competitive grants over 5 years for this, and our budget request reflects our desire to get those dollars moving. We need to support communities that already know often where the greatest resilience needs are, but haven't had dedicated funding to help them address that. And we're looking forward to working with project sponsors and with state, local, and tribal transportation authorities to get these dollars aligned in the right way to make that transportation infrastructure resilient for the future.
Thank you. No one saw it, but the gavel magically moved to me, and so I would like to now recognize Senator Scott for your questions.
Thank you. First, I want to thank Chair Cantwell for hosting this important hearing. Secretary, I've been calling on you to testify for more than 6 months to understand exactly what you've been doing with regard to inflation and the supply chain crisis. But first, let's talk about 16 months ago in January 2021, you were open to increasing the gas tax when you testified. Now we've seen this unbelievable increase in gas prices. So can you tell me where you are on increasing the gas prices or gas tax?
So as you know, there are a number of proposals in Congress on gas tax holiday provisions. I think that all options need to be on the table when it comes to relief. We also know there are...
That's fine, I got some more questions. So you're consistent that you still are open to raising the gas tax, so...
No, we are not open to raising the gas tax right now. We are open to provisions to provide relief, which are being discussed here in Congress.
Okay.
Thank you for the chance to clarify that.
Next, since you were here last time, inflation has gone from 1.4% to 8.5%. The Biden administration has called this raging inflation crisis and huge increases in prices a high-class problem. So do you believe this is 8.5% inflation is a high-class problem?
Sorry, which Biden administration member used those words?
I think it was Psaki. So it was a high-class problem.
So we view it as a problem, and that's why we're doing everything we can to cut costs for American consumers. Now, when it comes to gas, obviously an oil company doesn't check with the administration on how much to charge for the price of gas, but that's exactly why we feel a sense of...
So you believe that the only gas companies are the problem here, not the Biden administration shutting down the pipeline, making it difficult for more oil and gas to be produced in this country?
Well, as you know, there are thousands of permits right now for oil and gas production that the oil and gas companies are choosing not to use.
The leases are there, not the permits are there. Mm-hmm. Your administration has prevented people from getting the permits to drill for more oil and gas, so we're seeing record prices.
Well, I'm sure you're aware, Senator, of the statements from oil company executives that they're not pursuing production at this time because they're so profitable.
No, that's not true.
Statements.
Let me ask you another question. Secretary Raimondo was here last week, and she said that when I asked her, first off, do you take any responsibility for the inflation crisis we're having in the country?
We take responsibility for doing everything we can to ease shipping costs, which are one of the things, in my view, that contribute to inflation.
So Secretary Raimondo said that it was the Federal Reserve's problem, inflation was a Federal Reserve's problem. So do you agree with her that the Biden administration is not responsible, it has nothing to do with focused on tax increases, making it more difficult to get permits, this unbelievable regulatory environment that's causing inflation? You believe it's all the Federal Reserve?
Well, we certainly oppose tax increases, especially for the poor. But what I would also say is that in the balance between monetary and fiscal policy, both of those can have an effect on inflation. It's one of the reasons why we're acting to reduce the things in the shipping sector, the part that we view as most under the area of responsibilities of the Department of Transportation, knowing that that can contribute to high prices, right? You look at the spot rates, trucking, or whether we're talking about ocean shipping, And those are unquestionably part of the source of pressure on prices.
So you saw the GDP numbers. We had negative GDP for the first quarter, 1.4% down. So do you believe we have a roaring economy, as Secretary Raimondo said?
Well, if you look at the period of the Biden administration so far, obviously there's been exceptionally high rates of economic growth and exceptionally high rates of a drop in unemployment. We think that's due to the fiscal policies of this administration. We know it's going to take a lot of work to keep that going.
1.4% drop in GDP is pretty significant. You saw the crisis out in the ports in California, and what I was surprised is you've seen the pictures and that you only went out there one time. And why would you not have gone out there more when it was one of the biggest crises we've ever had in shipping in this country?
Well, one thing that we did was take advantage of opportunities to convene players from around the country virtually. I think I've met in person with physically as well as virtually with the directors of those ports, something like half a dozen times. But I would also add that when you see those ships backed up in LA and Long Beach, for example, part of that has to do with what's going on at the port, but a lot of that could be the result of issues that are thousands of miles inland. So it is just as important to be dealing with intermodal issues in the Midwest, the crisis of, or certainly a problem of availability of labor for truck driving, as it is the things that are actually physically located at the port. We're proud of the investments that we've made in ports on the West Coast and around the country.
Let me ask you one last question. So you've seen in the last, since President Biden got elected, you've seen gas prices way up, inflation up, supply chain crisis. You ran for president. You worked hard to become the president. What would you have done differently?
Done differently from?
Than the Biden administration has done.
Well, look, I'm sure hindsight will point to all kinds of things that we could refine, but what we're doing right now, I believe, is going to make the biggest difference. Now, of course, if we could persuade more of your colleagues to ease some of the other sources of pressure on families facing inflation, from insulin costs to the cost of childcare, we think that might take the edge off some of the dynamics of global petroleum markets. But faced with the tools that we have, we're proud of the work that we've done to cut the backlog of containers, to cut other things that are gumming up our supply chains. And you have my commitment that we'll continue that work.
Thank you.
Next, I recognize Senator Lujan for his questions.
Thank you so much, Chair Baldwin. Secretary Buttigieg, good to see you again, and I want to begin by thanking you for working with us. Senator Scott and I worked to pass the HALT Act, the Honoring Abbas Family Legacy to Terminate Drunk Driving Act, as part of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. The law requires, as you know, all new passenger cars to include impaired driving technology to end drunk driving once and for all. And now it's up to the Department of Transportation and NHTSA to implement this statute. One concern I do have, Mr. Secretary, though, is the National Roadway Safety Strategy you released in January of this year said that you would, quote, initiate a rulemaking, close quote, for other safety standards. But when the report discussed the HALT and RIDE Act, the document said, quote, consider a rulemaking effort. I'm concerned that your office is holding the requirement as a lesser standard and using consider when talking about the RIDE and HALT Act. Mr. Secretary, are you aware that Section 24220 of the IIJA requires you to issue a final rule within 3 years to require passenger motor vehicles to be equipped with advanced impaired driving prevention technology?
Thank you. Yes, and we are committed to implementing Section 24220.
And Mr. Secretary, the statute requires you to establish this rule, not consider it. Why then did the National Safety Strategy say and use the word consider?
I'll investigate the alignment of that language. What I know is that the final rule has to establish a federal motor vehicle safety standard that would also have to meet all the requirements that go into any FMVSS. I know that it will take a lot to ensure that the timelines can work, but what I can commit to you now, pending my double checking on the alignment of that language, is our desire to make sure that that happens as promptly as we responsibly can do.
I appreciate your commitment there, Mr. Secretary. Based on what I've been learning here is that OMB had something to say about this, and I hope that the OMB folks are listening in to this hearing. I'll be calling them soon to find out what's going on. From the beginning, we were warned that many of the auto manufacturers are going to do everything they can to delay and kill this. Not my words, theirs. And so, and I'm going to be on this. As you know, I'm a survivor of head-on drunk driving crash myself. And the families that I've met, and I know that you've met, they need this done. We need this done. We're losing too many Americans on the roads every year. And so we have to get it done. So I appreciate that and look forward to working with you and your team for that implementation. Hot air balloon regulations. We had a chance to chat on the streets during a short walk, but hot air ballooning in New Mexico is an important tradition and thriving industry. Last year, the Federal Aviation Administration began implementing regulations that were impossible for hot air balloon operators to follow. I want to thank you and your team for their responsiveness for fixing it for this year's hot air balloon festival in New Mexico. We know that much more must be done before the next and with upcoming rulemakings. After outreach by myself and Senator Heinrich, Representative Stansberry, the department granted that one-year waiver for this rule. So one of the questions that I have is, as the FAA continues to work on implementation of this rule and others, do I have your commitment to provide proactive communication and engagement with balloonists regarding rules or regulations that impact the industry?
Yes, the FAA will make sure to be in touch with the Albuquerque balloon community and the balloon community writ large. We know how important this is, not just recreationally, but economically in many places, including New Mexico.
I appreciate that, sir. And I know your travels and responsibilities are taking you in many areas, and I want to thank you for being as responsive as you've been across America. If time allows, I'd sure like to invite you to come on out to New Mexico again and to visit with those balloonists and to chat with them maybe directly, but we'll see if we can get some time, and God willing, we'll get you to New Mexico soon.
It would be a pleasure.
Appreciate that. And Madam Chair, I do have another question on tribal access and infrastructure funds. It's been my experience in the past, based on other infrastructure projects in previous years, that there has been not a strong environment to support investment in tribal communities, meaning that once one federal agency declares an emergency or accesses funds, it's hard to get an easement approved by the BIA or others. And sometimes those projects, which should take a few years, land up taking a decade or more. And I'm fearful what that would mean with the bipartisan infrastructure bill. So that's the series of questions that I have for the Secretary. I'll submit them into the question, but I'm hoping that we can find a way to find an expedited approval process, bringing federal agencies together, getting those approvals done as quickly as possible, rather than one being done and then it sets the clock for the next one, so that in tribal areas and these indigenous sovereign nations across America, they are not left out when it comes to infrastructure. So I appreciate that, and I'll get them to the record, Madam Chair. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lujan. Thank you for that important point about a government-to-government relationship. Senator Capito.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and welcome, Mr. Cabinet Secretary. Good to see you again. I have a couple quick questions, obviously. First, I'd like to comment on Taxiway A relocation project at West Virginia International Yeager Airport, which is my airport where I fly in and out of. Yeager does not meet the FAA's modern design standards because its taxiway, Taxiway A, is too close to the airport's sole runway. So we have a relocation project which would create this issue, and I support the FAA allowing the project to proceed through as a category exclusion. This issue is before the FAA, but I wanted to put it on your radar screen, and you don't need to comment on it unless you want to. But I wanted to also call to your attention the FAA contract tower program. This is really important for our aviation safety. We have 4 airports in the state of West Virginia. And also Congress created the competitive grant program, which allocates $20 million annually for 5 years. Will you and your team work with us to ensure that the contract tower program continues to play a key role in our nation's aviation systems?
Yes, we know how important this is, especially in smaller and rural communities, and we'll welcome the chance to continue to work with you on contract towers.
Thank you. The interagency dispute over spectrum policy, which with the FAA and aviation and 5G, Secretary Raimondo was before the committee, said that there had been a resolution working with the Spectrum Coordination Initiative at the DOC. How are we going to avoid these kinds of conflicts in the future? This one went on for a while before it kind of reared its head. How do you see this in the future? Is there an interagency group working on this so we can avoid these issues?
Yes, there have been a lot of discussions in the inter. There will be more spectrum overlap and conflict issues, and it's important for them to be addressed before any kind of deployment is looming. And as you know, the issue with aviation that happened early this year and that we're still working through was partly the consequence of regulators not all being on the same page before something went forward. And so
Regulator being the FCC and the FAA?
yeah, and you could view Commerce and the NTIA as having been part of that churn as well. So I know that the new leader of NTIA and Secretary of Commerce are committed to working with that. I've had dialogue with them. I know the White House also is encouraging that all of the different players, FAA, FCC, NTIA, I would add DOD in some cases, are at the table so that we can have the smoothest possible process for dealing with these issues as they come up in the future.
Right. I mean, we don't want to lose our expansion of 5G. We already know we're sort of a little behind on some of that. So resolutions of those kinds of conflicts on the front end are certainly going to save time and money and move us along. Let me ask you about the workforce issues. We just had Spirit Airlines has a seasonal flight out of the Charleston airport that goes from Yeager Airport to Myrtle Beach every summer, very popular. They canceled that flight for the summer, stating that they didn't have the workforce, and I'm assuming it's the pilots, but I don't know that that's the only part of the workforce that's having the great challenge. What are we going to do about this? I mean, this is system-wide. SkyWest, I know Senator Fisher mentioned that, as another one that impacts our Clarksburg Airport. How are you working at the department to meet this challenge?
Yes, thank you. This is a national issue. It's affecting the whole domestic aviation industry, but disproportionately affecting smaller regional carriers. And what we're seeing is that even major carriers have cut schedules on regional routes, largely because the larger carriers tend to offer the better salaries and can attract these pilots. Safety, of course, is such an important part of aviation. It leads to the necessity of very rigorous standards and requirements. But that doesn't mean we can't act to boost pilot recruitment and retention. I want to recognize that a lot of aviation industry players have been at the forefront of this, taking steps to expand the training and the recruitment of pilots. We have some tools that we can use as well, and the FAA will shortly be releasing a notice of funding opportunity for the Aircraft Pilots Workforce Development Grants Program, which is one example of a step we can take with federal funding to help boost that pipeline. There won't be a quick fix, but we've got to work on shoring up that domestic aviation workforce.
Do we have enough pilots trained, or is it a situation where we don't have enough at the very beginning that can transition into commercial airlines?
Yeah, I'd say we were already on track for a shortage, but then with the pandemic, you had early retirement programs. There were voluntary departures that were aimed at reducing the long-term costs that thinned out airline staff that have compounded that issue.
Well, we have the development of an aviation school in West Virginia right now through Marshall University, and we have one at Fairmont, and I understand Shepherd's going to get into that space as well. So we're doing what we hope we can do to help us fill those workforce issues. We also have it on the maintenance side too, so because that's just as important, and there's projected to be hundreds of thousands of jobs in that space in the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Capito. Senator Hitkin, let's see. Actually, Senator Blumenthal, if you're ready. If not, we'll allow our colleague. Would you like to go now? Senator Blumenthal.
Thank you so much for your service, and thank you for the good work that you're doing at the Department of Transportation. I apologize that I wasn't here earlier, so I'm going to try to avoid replicating questions you've already asked. Last Saturday, as you may know, May 1 was National Heat Stroke Prevention Day, and I want to commend NHTSA for its Look Before You Lock campaign again this year. We know in Connecticut this kind of tragedy can happen anytime. That's why I have worked hard on provisions in the Hot Cars Act, which passed into law in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act. very specifically the law your department to issue a rule requiring automakers to implement rear seat alerts in their vehicles. In my view, that language fails to go far enough. What we need is the requirement that there be detection, not just alerts, but detections in the back seats of cars. This is not an abstract or hypothetical issue. Just last week, I heard the heartbreaking story of a family who lost their child in a car that was equipped with rear seat alerts. In other words, a car would be compliant with the Infrastructure and Job Act's requirements. But this tragedy still occurred because the child was in the back seat and there was no detection system. This kind of technology is easy to implement. It would cost pennies if it's done on a mass scale. It's already been implemented by many manufacturers, at least by some. With apologies for this long-winded introduction, could you update us as to the status of the rulemaking requiring backseat alerts and your view about the possibility of requiring backseat detection systems?
Thank you. We recognize the importance of this. Since comprehensive data collection began in 1998, I believe 800 children have died of heat injuries after being trapped in a hot car. And this provision in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law we think will help. We want to make sure that we do everything we can to save lives. So NHTSA is hard at work on the rulemaking. We're aware of the interest from the safety community in other measures that could go further than the alert system, and we'll make sure to take all input on board during that rulemaking process.
Thank you. Another issue close to our hearts in Connecticut, and I should just tell you about the family of Corey Iodice. On April 20 of 2020, Corey stopped to assist a driver whose vehicle was disabled and never made it home. Corey was just doing his job, working for his family's business, when he was killed by a driver who didn't slow down or move over. His death could have been avoided. Connecticut, like other states, has a move over law that directs motorists to slow down and move over for stopped emergency and maintenance vehicles. These laws are critically important to the safety of our travelers and equally important people who assist them. I understand that obviously each state has its own laws, and it's partners with law enforcement and authorities to help raise awareness of slow down, move over laws. Can NHTSA play a more assertive or aggressive role in either providing incentives or imposing requirements or raising and elevating this issue so that more people are aware of it?
I'll have to investigate how NHTSA's authorities might overlap with or align with move-over laws. I'm certainly aware of them, and in the context of the National Roadway Safety Strategy, we want to make sure that we're contemplating those effects and meeting any responsibilities that we have in that direction.
Thank you. My time has expired, Madam Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Lummis.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and welcome, Mr. Secretary. It's nice to see you again. I know that Senator Fisher, Senator Capito, Senator Lujan have already raised this issue, but I'm going to raise it again because it makes you aware of just how significant it is in our states, and that is retention of commercial air service in our small communities. The largest regional airline in North America, SkyWest, recently announced it would be withdrawing from 29 markets due to a lack of pilots. And of course, what's unsurprising about this is that the most pullouts occur from some of the smallest markets in the country. Wyoming dodged a bullet on this one this time, but it's only a matter of time because our communities are small and they're far apart. So the economics are difficult for airlines. So knowing those challenges and recognizing that in the West, especially populated, that these are tough issues. Do you have any, what are you noodling about on this within the department?
So we certainly recognize the importance of EAS for so many communities. Let me mention two pieces that we're working on that touch on this. One is, as mentioned earlier to Senator Capito, is that question of a pilot shortage. And so making sure that we ensure a strong pipeline and, support an aviation sector that is competitive in retaining as well as cultivating talent is going to be important if we're to prevent further cases where pilot shortage is cited, as happened in the case of SkyWest, as a rationale for withdrawing from EAS. The second, though, is our direct authority to intervene in cases like this, and that's what we're using in the case of SkyWest. So proposals for replacement service are due next week on the 11th of May, and in the meantime, we have that holding action. And then the third thing, of course, is just continued support in the form of funding for EAS to make sure that it's able to robustly support the needs of communities where it is an economic lifeline in many cases. Of course, we see that in particular in smaller and rural communities.
And on the essential air service side, did you receive adequate funding in the infrastructure bill? Does your current budget provide for adequate funding for EAS?
So the budget request does include an increase for the payments to air carriers account of $18.7 million. Altogether, in the request, it's a funding level of $450 million. That's 368.7 out of the payments to air carriers appropriation, and then the overflight fees supplement that. That gets 81.2. Overflight fees took a hit because, of course, there was so much reduced air traffic in the past couple of years. Now we see that rebounding. We think that'll be helpful, and we do believe that the $450 million request is robust to support EAS.
Thank you. I want to join with Senator Lujan, who earlier invited you to his state. You could hit Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico right in a row and get a sense of the unique needs of our states. I know Senator Hickenlooper, who's probably your next questioner, would be delighted to host you as well. We'd love to show you the unique needs of our states with regard to a variety of transportation issues because of our large size and population dispersion. Our transportation needs, both in terms of highways and air service, are different from what you're going to see east of the Mississippi. So by all means, let's try to work with your staff to arrange for you to visit and get a sense of how truly different the Rocky Mountain West is when it comes to our special and unique needs. And thank you, Mr. Secretary. Look forward to working with you.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Senator Lummis. It sounds like you have a big Western invitation coming at you. Senator Hickenlooper.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Buttigieg, good to see you again. And again, thank you for your visit, I kept getting feedback from people in the small towns where you would stop and speak to the people that work on the roads and help us deal with the landslides and a lot of the issues that we've had to face and I'm sure you've been dealing with all across the country. So thank you for your service. Let me talk just for a moment about autonomous vehicles. I think they're a great opportunity for innovation. Benefits include safety, job creation, transformation of cities. While I was governor, we worked hard to ensure that Colorado would be welcoming to autonomous vehicle testing. And I guess one question I have is how would the DOT ensure America maintains leadership in the autonomous vehicle technology?
Well, As your question notes, a great deal is in the hands of the states, so we need to make sure there's a healthy state-federal partnership to support that. Many states have offered themselves up as test beds for some of this technology, and that the vehicles are safe. We've been working to make use of exemptions and flexibilities under current law, but would also very much welcome the opportunity to work with Congress on an updated national legislative framework on AVs. As you know, the federal regulations tend to pertain to the physical characteristics of the car. State law tends to be enforced around the conduct of the driver. And we have an area in terms of the car becoming the driver that's simply not contemplated by this existing division of labor.
Yeah, exactly. And I appreciate that because I think you can play a pivotal role here in trying to actually facilitate and maybe even orchestrate how this process goes forward so that, as with the case we talked some time ago about elevators, where they had autonomous elevators back at the end of the 19th century, and yet they were not fully accepted by the public for 50 years. Now, switching over to rail and reducing emissions from rail, obviously reducing carbon emissions from all manner of transportation has been a top priority. It should remain a top priority for the Department of Transportation. Passenger and freight rail require, I think, targeted solutions to integrate technology to both increase efficiency and reduce emissions. So how do you look at the DOT's work to improve rail efficiency in connection with our climate goals?
Well, as you mentioned, pound for pound, rail can be one of the most, I should say, one of the least carbon intensive ways to move goods. It's also a vital part of our goods movement system at a time when all eyes are on how we can improve the fluidity of our supply chains. Recently, I testified before the Surface Transportation Board, the first time I'm told in perhaps 2 decades that a Secretary of Transportation has done so, in order to emphasize the importance that our department places on the responsibilities of the STB and on freight, rail, and goods movement writ large. We see a lot of opportunity through enhanced data sharing, perhaps clarification to common carrier responsibilities, and other measures, some of which we can encourage, some of which are up to STB, some of which might be deserving of attention to Congress, all of which would add up to more fluid and effective rail service in this country, because if there's even an ounce of efficiency to wring out of the system, now is the time to capture it.
Yeah, absolutely. The aviation sector has also made many commitments to get to climate appropriate goals. Some companies in Colorado are developing aircraft relying on sustainable aviation fuel to reach net zero goals. How can programs such as the FAA's Continuous Lower Energy Emissions and Noise program, the CLEAN program, help support these efforts moving towards a cleaner energy for aviation?
So within the $42 million requested in the 23 budget for the CLEAN program that you just mentioned, there are 18 million that are specifically aligned for sustainable aviation fuels. We think that is the most promising near to medium-term tool that we have to reduce aviation's climate impact. We also are partnering with the Departments of Energy and Agriculture in the Sustainable Aviation Fuel Grand Challenge, trying to advance the development and the deployment of high-integrity sustainable aviation fuels. I should mention that I expect this will be a big subject at the September meeting of the International Civil Aeronautics Organization, and we want to make sure that America is leading the way toward SAF as it is being discussed in the global context, too.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and keep up the great work. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Senator Sullivan.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Mr. Secretary, good to see you. And I wanted to compliment your Undersecretary of Policy, Carlos Monge, who recently visited Alaska. He got all around the state, and we really appreciate that. I think he came away with a better sense of some of our challenges. As you're seeing here, Senator Lummis and others are all wanting you to get up to our states. I think the chair had a good idea. A big swing out west would help. You see all the unique challenges. I'll give you one in my state. We have over 200 communities who are not connected by roads. pretty unique challenge. And we're quite big, and like Wyoming, not very densely populated, so I think it's important for you to see that. Let me provide another invitation. Senator Cantwell and I are going to be hosting a meeting on May 23rd dealing with the two DoD strategic ports that matter a lot to our states, the Port of Tacoma, the Port of Anchorage. They're connected from a standpoint of economic activity together, but they're also very important to our military, to MIRAD, and unfortunately they were ranked the lowest in terms of readiness of the 18 DoD strategic ports. So we're trying to get together with the MIRAD administrator, the Transcom commander, Undersecretary Monet, and if you can make that as well, that would be an important meeting with two members, including the chairman of this committee. So mark your calendar on that one if you can make it. It's going to be important.
Senator Sullivan, if I could, how much of the product that goes to Alaska is delivered by water?
90%.
90% of what Alaskans consume is delivered by water?
Correct, and most of it comes through the great state of Washington. So it's important stuff.
But the point is, if the port infrastructure isn't supported more, then 90% of the goods can't be
correct
easily delivered or delivered at all. So,
yes.
Thank
so,
you.
Big priorities. You and I have talked about it, and the chair and I have been focused on it together. So we want you to try to make that. I won't try to get your commitment now, but if you can take a hard look at your calendar and try and make it, it would be really important. I also want to just mention, like so many other senators, essential air service for our state is also really, really important. Let me talk about another topic that I think hopefully you're concerned about. I certainly am concerned about. So I was one of the Republicans who voted for the bipartisan infrastructure bill. I'm on the EPW committee as well, which wrote a lot of that bill. And one of the things that we were able to get in that bill that we thought was very important was permitting reform. And you and I have actually talked about permitting reform. I think some of the biggest advocates in America for streamlining permitting, not cutting corners, but 10 years to permit a bridge, 20 years to permit a gold mine in Alaska. That happened. Now it's over 400 jobs at that mine, and it's called Kensington Mine. Our permitting system is broken. And so there has been a bipartisan effort, it was in the bipartisan infrastructure, to start addressing that. A number of us are talking about infrastructure and energy issues. Even yesterday, a bipartisan group, we had a discussion last night. NEPA was a really big topic of discussion, I think, bipartisan interest. I know when you and I talked during your confirmation process, mayors and governors in particular, regardless of political party, are very motivated by this because they see the challenges on the front lines when permitting takes 10 years to permit a bridge in America, which is just ridiculous. Were you consulted on this very recent NEPA regulation that came out of CEQ? Madam Chair, I'd like to submit a op-ed for the record. This is from the Wall Street Journal entitled "How to Kill American Infrastructure on the Sly." The White House revises NEPA rules that will scuttle new roads, bridges, and oil and gas pipelines.
I think it already was, but just to make sure, without
right.
objection.
Well, we'll do it again. Were you consulted on this? Because I'm reading through it, and I'm really concerned that what we all want to have happen now in terms of implementing the bipartisan infrastructure legislation is literally going to be delayed. I know it's going to be delayed by this new rule. Were you consulting on this, and do you have a view on it? And are you concerned that it's going to delay infrastructure projects?
So we're at the table in CEQ processes like this one and value the chance to weigh in. We want to make sure that all laws, including NEPA, are of course, complied with, and we also want to make sure that project delivery is prompt and efficient. One of the first things that we did coming out of the passage of the bipartisan law was to work on that one federal decision provision, which I think was a 60-day requirement to establish that pathway for and information about categorical risk can move through NEPA with very little friction. I certainly recognize where these concerns are coming from. Also, though, believe that with the right level of partnership, transparency, and technical assistance up front, these requirements need not unduly delay projects that are worthy and that are legally compliant.
So just real quick, I'm out of time, but just one quick follow-up. It's not just NEPA compliance. That rule has to comply with the bipartisan infrastructure bill itself, which had a number of important permitting reform provisions. Not as many as I would have liked, but it did have some. So can you commit to me to just make sure you're looking at that new CEQ rule and make sure it actually complies with the most recent law that just passed, which was about streamlining and moving projects more quickly? I think this new rule that was just promulgated is going to do the exact opposite. Can you commit to me to doing that?
Yes, my expectation is everything we do will comply with the bipartisan infrastructure law, and we'll certainly review that.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Senator Tester, are you ready?
I am.
Okay.
And I'll apologize if
Just
these
so
have been
my
asked.
colleagues know, I know we've been joined by a few people online and here, so the next recognition would be Senator Cruz, and then Sinema, and then Lee, and then Mr. Warnock.
So it's good to have you here, Secretary Buttigieg. As I think you already know, there's been a lot of legs of flights that have been canceled. And the reason they've told me is because don't have enough pilots. Not because of demand, the planes were full or nearly full, and they've cut it back. I'm going to have Delta in my office later this week, and I'm sure that's what they're going to tell me. Can't get enough pilots. So is the Department of Transportation playing in this realm as far as getting pilots? Because I don't care if you're talking about regional or whatever you want to talk. If a plane ain't flying, a plane ain't flying, okay? Are you guys playing in this game as far as trying to get more pilots available to these airlines? And if so, what are you doing? And when would you anticipate this problem being solved?
Thank you. Yes, we recognize a shortage of pilots that in some ways is not completely dissimilar to the shortage of truckers we're seeing. And we think it's related to a number of issues from the pipeline in to the thinning out of workforces that happened during the worst periods of COVID-related flight cancellations, to some questions about pay and conditions. As with truckers, there are many pilots who are very well paid, many who are less so, and that can make it difficult for regional players to be competitive. Airlines are taking the lead with cultivating students and building those skills, but we play a role too and are making sure that even as we speak, FAA funding is being aligned towards supporting a stronger pipeline of people into the profession.
And are you monitoring how the FAA is utilizing these dollars? Is it, what I'm saying is, are we actually getting more people trained, or are we funding and saying do it, or who's watching them? Are you doing
yes,
that?
I've requested updates on how those dollars are being used, and we'll want to see them translate, obviously, into outcomes as we go.
And when did those dollars go to them? And is it translated to a bigger pipeline yet? And when do we anticipate, I mean, I'll be honest with you, because of the legs that have been shot, I drive 4.5 hours sometimes to get a flight that gets back out here so I don't have to fly halfway around the world to get to Washington, D.C. So and if I'm doing that, every business person in the state's doing that too.
Mm-hmm. So what I can tell you is that we're gathering information on how that needle is moving, and be happy to stay in touch with your office about what we're seeing and what resources we need.
I would like that. Last week you testified in person before the Surface Transportation Board, becoming the first sitting transportation secretary to do that in more than 20 years. Thank you. The issue that brought you there was an ongoing supply chain disruption, the continuing challenge of keeping consumers from being able to buy the products they need, keeping farmers unable to bring their products to their ultimate final destination. It's a big complex program with problem with a lot of interconnecting parts, ocean carriers, ports, trucking, freight rail, it's going to take a lot of work to resolve the problems and to make sure that we don't end up at this point again. So, Mr. Secretary, based on everything that you've seen and heard, what concrete steps do we need to take, do you need to take to get past this?
So several things, and as you noted, we testified at STB about this and have engaged too. We think there are a number of steps that could deliver more fluidity in the system. Some are things that we're pressing on in the industry, including data sharing and clarified common carrier standards. But I would also say we have a role to play ourselves in delivering infrastructure that will help with fluidity, eliminating rail crossings and other uses of the CRISI program, which Congress has provided us with the funds to do, and it's one of the main supply chain relevant uses of the dollars in the infrastructure law, and we're working with all deliberate speed to get those out there.
As far as this budget goes, do you believe it's adequate to continue to address the problem in a timely way?
We believe it's a major step up and will be certainly enough to make a big difference. We'll be the first to say it if we think more resources are needed.
Doesn't everybody? Thank you very much. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Cruz.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Secretary Buttigieg, welcome.
Morning.
I want to start by discussing President Biden's Disinformation Governance Board, or as many of us are calling it, the Ministry of Truth, that was recently announced. You said in 2019, quote, "The point of defending free speech is not that you expect everyone to be perfectly aligned with every speech act that is protected. It's that that's a fundamental American freedom. It's a huge part of what makes America, America. And when that same flag was on my shoulder, I didn't think of the flag as something that itself, as an image, was sacred. I thought of it as something that was sacred because of what it represented. One of the very things it represented is the freedom of speech, and that's one of the reasons I served." Now, I got to say, Secretary Buttigieg, that's a sentiment I wholeheartedly agree with, and I think most Americans do as well. Simple question, do you still believe that?
Of course.
That freedom of speech should not be subject to censorship by the government?
Sure.
Why is the Biden administration then putting someone who is an obvious partisan, someone who is engaged in the repeated pushing of misinformation, putting them in charge of a board ostensibly directed at regulating the free speech of American citizens?
Let me begin by acknowledging that this is outside of my area of expertise and responsibility as a department. But I should also note that when I was wearing that flag on my shoulder, I was qualified in what the Navy calls information warfare, knowing that the use of misinformation...
Okay, with respect, we got limited time. So should the government be censoring and regulating the speech of American citizens, yes or no?
So that's a complex philosophical question. Obviously, we believe in free speech, but as you know, you don't have the right to yell fire in a crowded theater. If you regard that as the government regulating speech, then I suppose you would have to agree the answer.
Should the government silence voices that are politically inconvenient and that it disagrees with?
As a matter of course, in our domestic politics, of course not.
So why is the Biden administration creating a board to do that?
I believe this is based on the awareness that misinformation and disinformation is used as a weapon against the American people.
So was the Hunter Biden laptop misinformation?
I'm not familiar with all of the details of those stories. What I know is that Russia, notably, and other players too.
Except it wasn't Russia. It's an accurate laptop. Now the New York Times has acknowledged that after the election, and yet the head of this disinformation board happily pushed out that it was disinformation. That is a code word for things that are politically inconvenient. Let's turn to a different topic. As you are well aware, recently a federal court struck down the mask mandate. When that happened, Americans across the country saw footage of people on planes hearing the announcement over the loudspeaker and cheers bursting out. When I flew to D.C. from Houston yesterday, on the plane, I would say there are fewer than 10% of the people who chose to wear masks. Does it concern you that the Biden administration was putting in place a policy that now a federal court has concluded was illegal, and that a huge percentage of Americans found arbitrary and unjustified?
If I'm not mistaken, most Americans support the mask mandate for flights, but I think a lot of us are also pleased.
So why were
to
they
be-
cheering on planes?
How's that?
Why were they cheering on planes?
Look, I think a lot of us have been looking forward to the day when that reverted to being a personal choice. I know I have, and I've been saying so throughout.
So,
course, the CDC
so
also-
you're the Secretary of Transportation. Is it safe to travel on?
So people should make their own choice. It's no longer required.
So when you next fly commercial, will you wear a mask?
Depends where I'm traveling to, and
Commercial flight anywhere. You're on a plane. You're flying from one American city to another American city.
I'm not sure. It'll depend on conditions that day. I don't have a flight today, but next time I do, I'll think it over.
Okay, so under the current CDC guidance, which is actually posted on the Department of Transportation website, it says, quote, CDC continues to recommend that people wear masks in indoor public transportation setting at this time. It also says, quote, traveling on public transportation increases a person's risk of getting and spreading COVID-19 by bringing people in close contact with others, often for prolonged periods. I and many others are very dismayed with both CDC and the Department of Transportation for the politicization of this issue. But do you agree with those statements?
Well, I certainly support the CDC as the authority in this country on public health determinations. And I share your I share your dismay at the politicization of masks. I think the most important thing by far, Senator, is that whether it's on a flight or a bus or anywhere else, respect is shown to those who wear masks and to those who choose not to.
So let me ask you if you agree with the CDC statement that's on the Department of Transportation website. Multiple pictures came out this weekend from you at the White House Correspondents' Dinner. You weren't wearing a mask. You were having a good time, laughing. There were jokes were being told. How did that not qualify as, to use the CDC's words, bringing people in close contact with others, often for prolonged periods? And why did you make the choice not to follow that dictate?
So I made a personal risk decision consistent with the public health guidance and rules in effect, which, as you know, did not require the wearing of masks in that environment. And I would add, if I'm not mistaken, the CDC mandate for aircraft would have expired by now.
Why is the administration appealing that decision and presumably trying to reinstate the mask mandate even now?
I would not agree with the premise of that question. The reinstatement of the mask mandate is not the same as the rationale for appealing. I don't have the legal background that you do, but my understanding is that the appeal concerns whether the CDC has the authority to do that in this pandemic or in any pandemic, which is completely distinct from whether a mask mandate ought to be applied any given day. And again, as I understand it—
So are you telling this committee that even if you prevail on the appeal, that the administration is not going to reimpose the mask mandate?
Well, it's not me saying so. It would have expired by today.
Well, but prior to the court decision, the administration kept extending it despite little to no scientific basis for that.
You'll recall the extension was only 2 weeks, and if I'm not mistaken, those 2 weeks would have passed by now.
So are you saying that you don't intend to extend it even if you prevail on appeal?
Well, it's not up to me. It's TSA acting on CDC guidance. But yes, I mean, it is certainly the case, barring something that would have led to an extension, that the mask mandate would have expired, which means that even if the case is won—
And you think it should have been allowed to expire?
Based on the conditions at the time that it was set for 2 weeks, yes. Okay. But again, that's not my call. It's the CDC's call.
Thank you. Senator Sinema.
Thank you, Chair Cantwell, and thank you to my friend Secretary Buttigieg for joining us today. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law represents a historic investment in our national transportation infrastructure that will update and modernize our highways, bridges, airports, railroads, and public transit systems. For example, Arizona will receive an additional $200 million annually above existing funding levels for our highways and bridges over the next 5 years. The Department of Transportation has a crucial role to play in dispersing these funds from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law to make sure the money is distributed equitably and consistent with the provisions of the law. So I look forward to working with you, Secretary, and with my colleagues on this committee to continue to advance implementation of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law to help Arizona families and small businesses get ahead. One significant highway project to Arizona is expanding Interstate 10 on the 26 miles the highway passes through lands belonging to the Gila River Indian community. Arizona motorists rely on this stretch of the I-10 to travel between Phoenix and Tucson, and when departing Phoenix to connect to Interstate 8 south of Casa Grande. This is the only stretch of the I-10 that narrows to 2 lanes between Arizona's 2 largest metropolitan areas. Congestion on this part of I-10 costs Arizona motorists time and money and hinders the ability of commercial products to arrive at their destinations on time. For fast-growing states like Arizona, highway expansion projects are an important piece of addressing our state's transportation challenges, along with improving other transportation modes, such as public transportation. So Secretary, competitive grant funding made available through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and give me your commitment to distributing highway funding consistent with the statutory provisions within the law.
Well, thank you, Senator. And the short answer is yes. I'm, of course, committed to making sure that all funding formula and discretionary is distributed consistent with the provisions of the law. The corridor in the area that you're describing is a good example of a place where, for safety reasons and for throughput reasons, we need to consider new kinds of investment. And I have every expectation that competitive applications will be coming in from the region.
Well, thank you. Under the provisions of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, Arizona airports are expected to receive $348 million for infrastructure improvements over the next 5 years. For budget year 2022, Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport will receive over $41 million under our law, and every airport in Arizona will see increased funding. Senator Kelly and I enjoyed hosting you at Sky Harbor in November of last year to tour the new concourse at Terminal 4, which will serve thousands of travelers every day once it becomes operational. Our infrastructure law also includes funding for the $5 billion airport terminal program and $5 billion for air traffic control towers. Could you provide us an update on those aviation infrastructure programs?
Thank you, and it was a pleasure to visit Sky Harbor with you and Senator Kelly and see the work that's going on. We're working as swiftly as we can to make sure that all of this funding is aligned and ready to be distributed, recognizing that there is a great deal of need for improvements and enhancements, whether we're talking about our terminals or in some cases runway and other enhancements, and that are going to serve to make our airports not only more effective in moving passengers and goods, but also more environmentally sustainable and more accessible to all. That's something I was especially impressed with in seeing the plans at Sky Harbor. We'd be happy to provide your office with more detailed timelines on the notices of funding opportunity and the formula apportionments, but can tell you that we're working to meet all statutory deadlines and to get these dollars delivered efficiently.
Well, thank you. On that same trip last November, you also visited the Valley Metro's Northwest Extension. That will extend Phoenix's light rail system across Interstate 17 to the former Metro Center property that's currently undergoing redevelopment. Now, Arizona's public transit systems are also expanding in other places as well, like the Valley Metro's South Central expansion and the Tempe streetcar, which will be opening to riders later this month. The Bipartisan Infrastructure Law increased our public transit investment in communities of all sizes. And I'm particularly proud of a provision that I worked on with Senator Moran to increase funding to small transit-intensive cities. These are cities like Flagstaff and Yuma that have under 200,000 residents, but enjoy high-performing transit systems. So as the former mayor of a city of about that same size, can you talk to us about the importance of public transit investment in these smaller communities?
Thank you. It's a very important topic. I know that when people hear transit, it often evokes images of subways in some of our biggest cities. And of course, that's a very important part of the American transit story, but so is transit in lower density communities. I think there is a great deal of potential now, especially with new technologies of micro-mobility connecting into transit systems and some alternatives to traditional hub and spoke models of how bus systems and related transit systems work to better serve these kinds of communities where the need is as great or greater, and to create alternatives so that people, whether they own a car or not, have many ways to get to where they need to be that are affordable, sustainable, and reliable.
Well, thank you. Chair Cantwell, with that, I yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you, Senator Sinema. Senator Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here and for your service. On March 31st, so just a few weeks ago, NHTSA finalized CAFE standards, pursuant to which cars and light trucks would be required to meet an industry-wide fleet average of about 49 miles per gallon by 2026. Tell me, how much will that rule cost on an average vehicle?
I'll have to pull the statistics for you and send them. What we know is that
It's safe for me to assume that it will cause a cost increase. I mean, that's going to require, we don't have this would require innovation of new technologies.
Yes, it'll require innovation and investment, but of course also yield savings to the tune of hundreds of dollars per customer.
Hundreds of dollars per customer per year in fuel savings. Is that what you're describing? Any idea how much it will cost on the vehicle, though?
Again, let me pull the exact numbers and provide those to your office.
Well, thank you. I do worry about this because the average American family is struggling to get by, especially with inflation. It's causing a concern that worries me a lot.
Respectfully, Senator, that's exactly why we think these rules are so important, because the gas savings for families will mean savings in people's pockets at a time when we got to fight inflation with everything we've got.
Right. And that's why it's also important to ask this question, though, as to whether this really will mean savings. Now, the CAFE standards at issue also deal with the possibility that regulatory compliance can be achieved by a manufacturer if, I think the threshold is 17%. If 17% of a manufacturer's sales consist of electric vehicles. But of course, electric vehicles require access to a lot of minerals like cobalt and lithium for their batteries. So will this mandate end up impacting our demand for cobalt, lithium, and other minerals in a way that will make us more dependent on countries like Russia and China, where we get some of these minerals?
So one very important issue with EVs is sourcing the raw materials and the refining capacity as well for them that go into batteries. And there's been a lot of work that I've discussed with many of the U.S. auto industry leaders on how to onshore or nearshore more of that. A lot of resources, including lithium, exist in the U.S., untapped, and certainly a preferred alternative to some of the international foreign sources that are currently leading in some of these raw material needs.
What's the average cost of an electric vehicle?
Well, averages can be misleading. The last I saw was a Kelley Blue Book figure at $55,000, but that includes a $189,000 Porsche. If you look at the vehicles that are coming online now, they start in the mid to high 20s and go up from there.
Yeah. It does concern me. I mean, overall, it's a higher price point. Yeah, I understand that it includes higher-end vehicles, but it's a relatively few number of those higher-end vehicles that are being sold. And the technology does cost money. So if we're not careful, and this could end up being a regressive policy, one that affects the poor and hardworking middle-class Americans and people in rural communities, people who are already struggling with inflation and have a difficult time getting from one place to another as it is. I don't want us making it so expensive we price them even further out of the market. Let's switch gears recently to talk about the transportation mask mandate. I know this was discussed a moment ago with one of my colleagues. As a policy matter, do you think that the masks ought to be required as a condition, legal condition for interstate travel?
As a policy matter, I've deferred to the CDC and the TSA, who have the authorities in this regard.
Right, but you're the Transportation Secretary. You've got a role specifically in transportation. What are your policy views on how that affects transportation and whether this is worth the difficulty that it creates?
The difficulty of wearing a mask?
Yeah. So, I mean, you noted a few moments ago in response to a question by Senator Cruz that you think the standard ought to be people need to show respect for those who wear masks and respect for those who choose not to wear masks. There are a few ways in which more disrespect can be shown than by threatening to arrest those not wearing masks, choosing not to wear masks.
So just to be clear, I don't mean people who are not wearing a mask in a way that breaks the law. What I mean is in an environment where a mask mandate has been lifted, be it on a bus or an airplane, that hopefully everybody is treated respectfully.
And it's been lifted by court order. That court order is being appealed. So if the standard ought to be showing respect to those who are masked and those who are not, why would the administration appeal it?
Well, I think it's important to establish the CDC's authorities in this regard. I mean, we have any number of safety measures as a country, including transportation, ranging from the requirement to wear seatbelts to the requirement to wear masks during a pandemic.
All right, I see my time's expired. I'll ask you some of these in writing, but the administration has yet to rule out vaccine mandate for interstate travel. I'll ask you about that and a few other things in writing. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Lee. Senator Warnock, thank you for your indulgence.
No problem. Thank you so very much, Madam Chair. And Mr. Secretary, it's great to see you again.
Likewise.
I know that you've been down to my home state of Georgia. You've been to Atlanta and my hometown of Savannah. And you've seen up close the overpasses, the highways, the bridges that help Georgians get to where they need to go. But unfortunately, many of these bridges and highways were built directly through historic communities without any concern for how it would affect the folks who live there, disproportionately affecting historic Black communities. When we look at these bridges, these overpasses, it's kind of landscape history of the arc of our country. These projects contributed to poor air quality in the communities, diminished access to jobs and economic opportunity, literally split communities in half. And they disrupted the rich culture of these neighborhoods. I was down in my hometown of Savannah, Georgia, and some of the folks who were older than me were talking about how the community, the very community where I grew up, had once been a vibrant jazz community, restaurants, Black businesses, all disrupted by I-16 that literally goes straight through the middle of these communities. And then Sweet Auburn Avenue, where I serve as pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church. Historic community, lots of Black businesses, America's largest concentration, in fact, of Black-owned businesses, also disrupted. When we look at these structures built in the name of urban renewal, this is structural racism in the most literal sense of the word. And that's why I fought to reverse the damage done by highways and other large infrastructure projects by securing $1 billion in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law for the Reconnecting Communities program. And so, Mr. Secretary, what is the Transportation Department's timeline for implementing this very important program that I think in a literal sense builds what Dr. King called the beloved community? And how will you ensure that the program accomplishes our goals?
Thank you, Senator. We are hard at work at delivering the first year's funding for the Reconnecting Communities pilot program that you and your colleagues have provided. $195 million will be ready to go out in a notice of funding opportunity that we hope to put forward by the end of June. And what we already know is that there will be applications from places around the country like those that you cited in Georgia. We've seen it everywhere from Jackson Ward in Richmond that I visited not too long ago to the area around I-81 in Syracuse to the Hill District in Pittsburgh. And often, as you said, tearing the fabric of communities and knowing that transportation infrastructure ought to connect and never to divide. Right. We recognize the moral as well as policy imperative to ensure that if federal dollars went into those divisions, federal dollars go into healing them as well.
Thank you so much. And, you know, as I talked to the folks down in Savannah, they were very excited to hear about this, and I hope we can deliver for those folks in Atlanta and all across our country who are on the underside of this shameful legacy of progress at the expense of certain historic communities. I always feel pride, you know, I'm sorry to talk about Savannah so much, but that's my hometown. And one of the things I'm proud of is Savannah's port and how they showed remarkable ingenuity and adaptability in the face of supply chain challenges last year. For example, they were the ones who came up with the idea of using pop-up container yards to unclog the port and keep supply chains running. And I'm glad that I was able to work with you and your office, work well with us to secure more than $8 million for the Georgia Ports Authority to alleviate congestion at the Port of Savannah and fund these pop-up container yards. How did funding for the Port of Savannah and the rest of Georgia's transportation network support the department's national priorities for improving transportation infrastructure and restoring supply chain resiliency?
Well, you rightly have a lot to be proud of in terms of the work that's gone on with the Georgia Ports Authority and the Port of Savannah, and appreciate you creativity of problem solving that went into concepts like that pop-up or temporary container yard, an approach that's now being emulated in Oakland, in the Pacific Northwest, and I think will continue to be emulated in other areas of the country as well, and one that matters not only for the import of goods, but for the export of agricultural products, which is one area where Savannah leads. We think that those kinds of flexible and original approaches need to be matched with more permanent improvements, which we are now able to make thanks to the funding in this bipartisan infrastructure law on everything from the ports themselves to the rails and highways that connect them to the rest of the country.
Well, thank you for your work on this. I'm glad I was able to secure $11 billion for Georgia's roads, bridges, highways, ports, other critical infrastructure. I look forward to working with you on this and also reconnecting these communities.
Likewise, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Secretary Buttigieg. I think that concludes our hearing. I'm going to submit a question about some of the other senior staffing challenges that you have, particularly for air traffic, commercial space, aviation safety, including flight standards and air certification. I hope that you will respond to those and use your leadership to help prioritize those safety reforms that Congress mandated. And I just want to note, that exchange with Senator Cruz, I think the difference between the challenges we make every day as a flying public and the event you just attended is that everybody there got tested and had a clearance prior to that event. And here we are now on planes not knowing what everyone's status is. We have, my colleague Senator Scott and I have suggested and have continued to push forward on temperature checks at airports in a broad way that some of our international colleagues have had great success on. So thank you for considering that and continuing to work on it. This hearing will remain open for 2 weeks until May 17th, 2022. Any senator who would like to submit questions for the record, do so by May 17th, 2022, and the Secretary responses return to the committee as quickly as possible, but no later than May 31st, 2022. So again, thank you for being a great partner with us on the infrastructure bill. Thank you for your due diligence. I think you can see from our colleagues here, they appreciate when you visit our states. And I think that that interaction and helping us with this infrastructure investment and getting it out the door will be great for America. Thank you very much. The committee is adjourned.